A woman vanished from her own kitchen, not from a highway, not from a train station, not from a parking lot, but from the middle of an ordinary home in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Her young son was still inside. Her car was still there. Her life was still sitting in place around her. But Joan Carolyn Risch was gone, and in the kitchen there was blood. This is the disappearance of Joan Risch, one of the strangest missing person cases in New England history. On October 24, 1961, Joan Risch was living in Lincoln, Massachusetts, a quiet town where a disappearance like this should have felt almost impossible. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was, from the outside, living a stable suburban life. But by the end of that day, her name would become attached to a mystery that has lasted for more than 60 years. The confirmed core of the case is simple and disturbing. Joan Risch disappeared from Lincoln, Massachusetts, on October 24, 1961, and she remains listed as missing. But the details around that disappearance are anything but simple. That day, Joan's husband was away on business. Her daughter was spending time at a neighbor's house. Her young son was inside the home. Nothing about that afternoon should have become a crime scene. But sometime before the household returned to normal, something happened. When Joan's daughter came back, her mother was not there. At first, this might have seemed like a misunderstanding. Maybe Joan had stepped outside. Maybe she was with a neighbor. Maybe she would come back in a minute. But then the house began to tell a different story. There was blood in the kitchen. Public summaries of the case describe a trail of blood leading from the house toward the driveway after Joan's daughter returned and found her mother missing. There was no body. There was no clear explanation. There was no Joan. That is the contradiction that has kept this case alive. A kitchen with blood suggests injury. A missing woman suggests movement, but the absence of a body turns every theory into a problem. If Joan was murdered inside the house, where was she taken? If she was injured, how far could she have walked? If she left on her own, why leave behind a scene that looked so alarming? If someone staged the house, what were they trying to make people believe? The first theory is the most obvious one. Someone attacked Joan inside the home. The blood in the kitchen may have come from a struggle. The trail toward the driveway may suggest that she was moved or that she tried to escape. This theory explains the fear of the scene. It explains why Joan vanished suddenly. It explains why the house seemed to hold evidence of violence. But it has one enormous weakness. No body was found. No confirmed suspect publicly solved the case. No final answer was recovered from the blood-stained kitchen. The second theory is that Joan was injured accidentally and left the house in shock. Maybe she cut herself badly. Maybe she suffered a medical emergency. Maybe panic took over. In this version, Joan may have walked away confused, bleeding, and unable to explain what had happened. That would explain the movement away from the house. It might explain why there was no immediate confrontation witnessed by neighbors. But again, the problem is distance. If Joan left injured, she should have been found. Lincoln was not an empty desert. There were roads, there were houses, there were people close enough that her daughter had been playing nearby. So how does an injured woman vanish completely? The third theory is the one that makes people argue even decades later. Some believe Joan may have staged her own disappearance. This theory usually comes back to one strange detail. Joan reportedly had an interest in books about disappearances and crime. Later discussion of the case often focused on library books connected to vanished women, violent cases, and staged disappearances. To some people, that detail feels impossible to ignore. A woman reads about disappearances. Then she disappears. The kitchen is left with blood. A body is never found. It sounds almost written, but reality is not always a clean story. People read strange books all the time. A person's reading history can look meaningful only after something terrible happens. And the voluntary disappearance theory asks us to believe something very difficult. It asks us to believe Joan left her children behind. It asks us to believe she used real blood, or created the appearance of real danger. It asks us to believe she walked away from her entire life and successfully remained hidden forever. That is possible in fiction, but in real life, every step creates risk. You need money, you need transportation, you need a place to go, you need silence from anyone who helps you, and you need to never make a mistake. For more than 60 years, that is why the staged disappearance theory is tempting, but not simple. It answers some questions while creating others. The fourth theory is that Joan was taken by someone who entered her life suddenly that day. Not necessarily a planned killer, maybe a delivery person, maybe someone asking for help, maybe someone who knew her only slightly. This theory explains why the scene may have begun quietly. It explains why there may not have been enough noise to alert everyone nearby. A person at the door does not look dangerous at first. A short conversation can turn into a threat. A normal afternoon can become unrecoverable in seconds. But this theory still needs a route. How was Joan removed? Was she alive when she left the house? Was there more than one person involved? Did anyone see a vehicle and forget it because it seemed ordinary? In a quiet town, the ordinary can be the perfect disguise. A car parked at the curb, person walking away, a neighbor glancing through a window and thinking nothing of it. Only later does everything become suspicious. The problem is that memory changes after fear enters the room. People remember what they saw, but they also remember what they later learned. And after a case becomes famous, the mind starts rewriting ordinary moments into possible clues. That does not mean witnesses are lying. It means memory is human, and human memory is fragile. One of the most haunting parts of Joan Risch's case is the child upstairs. That detail makes the disappearance feel even more impossible. If Joan left willingly, why leave her young son inside? If she was attacked, did the attacker know the child was there? If she was injured, did she try to get help but never make it? Every theory has to pass through that room. A mother vanished, but motherhood remained in the house. Toys, rooms, a sleeping child, all the proof that Joan had not simply been an isolated figure in a mystery. She was connected to people who needed her. That is why the case feels so emotionally cruel. It is not just a puzzle. It is a family interrupted in the middle of a normal day. The more you look at the case, the more the kitchen becomes the center of everything. A kitchen is supposed to be domestic. It is where meals are prepared, where children come in asking questions, where phones ring, where the day moves in small routines. But Joan's kitchen became the opposite. It became a question, a scene without a final act, blood without a body, motion without a destination, a disappearance without an ending. Investigators searched. The community watched, newspapers reported, the story spread, but Joan did not return. No confirmed body closed the case. No confession explained the kitchen. No single theory became strong enough to replace all the others. That is what makes this case so enduring. It is not empty. There are clues. There is blood. There is a timeline. There are possible sightings and interpretations. There are books. There is a home. But none of it forms a complete answer. The case remains trapped between two terrifying possibilities. Either something terrible happened to Joan Risch inside her own home, and the person responsible escaped with her body, or Joan somehow left the house herself, bleeding or pretending to bleed, and disappeared into a life no one ever found. Both possibilities are disturbing. Both leave behind questions that do not go away, and both begin in the same place. Kitchen, a child upstairs, a car still at the house, a woman missing, and blood that seemed to say something happened, but not enough to say what. Today, Joan Carolyn Risch remains listed as an endangered missing person. Her disappearance is still discussed because it does not behave like a simple crime. It behaves like a locked room with one wall missing. You can see the evidence. You can see the fear. You can see the place where the story should explain itself. But when you step closer, the answer is gone. More than 6 decades later, the question remains. Did Joan Risch become the victim of a violent stranger? Did she suffer an accident and vanish in shock? Did she stage the scene after reading about other disappearances? Or did the house preserve only part of the truth, while the rest walked out the door with her? Joan Risch vanished from a home that still looked full of her life. And that may be why the case still feels so unsettling. Because the most frightening disappearances are not always the ones that happen far away. Sometimes they happen in the room where someone was supposed to be safest.